My name is Erin Lasley. I've traveled many different roads in my life. I've been a law enforcement officer and first responder in the United States Coast Guard. I've worked in a couple of psychiatric hospitals, but now I'm a professional historian and podcaster. I've also had an interest in true crime for most of my life. In this podcast, I study some of the most notorious crimes through the lens of a historian and analyze what may have inspired criminals, investigators, and even society during the commission of those crimes and investigations. Join me as we look into the history behind the crime. Hey y'all, welcome back to another episode of The History Behind the Crime. I am currently sitting at my home. When I was writing this, I was sitting at home as the remnants of Hurricane Beryl made its way through southern Illinois. And guess what? My basement floods, which isn't all that surprising since the house was built in 1947 during the post-World War II GI construction boom. It's cool, though, since the pump works, and all my boxes down there are on shelves. But I discovered it's a little eerie having a basement. I've never really had a basement before, and I'm thankful that I'm really hard of hearing, just in case there are any creepy noises coming from down there. And no thank you, ghosts. I've seen The Conjuring, and I ain't falling for that. When I was house hunting, I jokingly asked the owner if anyone had ever died in the house before. And while he had never heard of anyone passing away in the house, he couldn't promise no one had ever been, unknowingly murdered and the body disposed of elsewhere. I know he was trying to be funny, and I give him credit for having a sick sense of humor, you and me. But now I'm just wondering if I should have the house cleansed anyway. I mean, does anyone know a good exorcist? There is a Catholic church literally on the next street, but it's also a school, and I highly doubt Father Marin is there teaching 6th grade social studies while combating the forces of hell. So, I don't know. I do think I need a young priest and an old priest. As a historian, I'm pretty well versed when it comes to English royalty. Yes, my UK and Irish listeners, this one is for you. I expect all sorts of emails correcting me on all the things I messed up on, especially a lot of Irish pronunciation. But bear with me. Anyway, my first taste of royalty started when I was around, 12 or 13, and saw a picture of teenage William. Suddenly, every other teenage heartthrob took a backseat to Prince William. I mean, he was hot, and he was a prince. Jackpot. But obviously today, I'm more Team Harry. This led to my fascination with the royal family, and couple that with my history fascination, I was suddenly entrenched in history, going all the way back to Alfred the Great, who, quick side note, is my extremely great-grandfather. Both Alfred and my maternal side descend from Charles the Great, the first Holy Roman Emperor. But a lot of people with European heritage descend from that guy. He had 5 wives and at least a dozen concubines and had more than 20 children. Moving on, where was I? English royals. While some of the early English royals were, pretty entertaining, my area of study started with Henry II, the first Plantagenet king, mainly because I was a fan of his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was a badass in her own right. This family was so messed up, with sons turning against father and sons turning against each other and husband locking his wife up and on and on. I mean, They could have had their own reality show. Honestly, I think the Kardashians have nothing on the Plantagenets. But this episode is not about them. I just wanted you all to know that I love me some historic royal drama. If you do want to know more about the Plantagenets, because, who doesn't? May I recommend English historian Dan Jones's two books, one entitled The Plantagenets and the other one, The War of the Roses. His books read like fiction, so you won't fall asleep. If you don't care for books, the books were also made into docuseries, also hosted by Dan himself, and you can find them on YouTube. They're actually really good, and some parts are quite steamy. But the Plantagenets were not the only royal family filled with family feuds and intrigues and divorce and death. I mean, obviously, we're all familiar with the Tudors. The HBO series, even though not historically accurate, showed us all how, effed up in the head they are, or were. But there were also the Stuarts, the Hanovers, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, and finally the House of Windsor, which those last two are actually the same family, just with a different name, politics and all. And that's the family we're going to talk about today, the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha/Windsor. Okay, we're not going to talk about the entire family, but concentrate on one man, Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas Mountbatten, 1st Earl Mountbatten of Burma, more commonly known as Lord Mountbatten, or King Charles II's great uncle on his father's side, and also related on his mother's side too. Lord Mountbatten was Queen Elizabeth's second cousin. Queen Elizabeth and her husband, Prince Philip, were third cousins. Though technically he was a Battenberg, his maternal line stems from the Gotha crew, and he was practically a Windsor, though some people would argue with me on that point, which is cool. Alright, backing up a little bit, and if you have time, go ahead and whip out, Queen Victoria's family tree, okay? And I'm talking about the family tree starting with her. You may need it. I'm going to try to make this as simple as possible because we got crime to discuss. Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, who were also first cousins, had 9 children, all of whom survived to adulthood, all of whom married foreign princes or princesses, except for Louise, who married the Duke of Argyll. And most of them had children of their own. Many of these children also married into other royal European houses. During World War I, pretty much every royal European house was related to each other through Victoria and Albert's offspring. Some of these royal offspring with foreign titles were born in the United Kingdom and were British citizens, such as Princess Alice of Battenberg and Prince Louis of Battenberg, who were great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria through their mother, Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine, who was the daughter of Princess Alice, Victoria's third child. Princess Alice of Battenberg went on to marry Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. Their youngest son was Prince Philip, who would go on to marry his third cousin, Elizabeth, who was the great-great-granddaughter of Victoria through Elizabeth's father, George VI, through his father, George V, through his father, Edward VII, who was the oldest son of Victoria. Honestly, it really helps to have a family tree in front of you, and I'm just telling you this because I'm this much of a nerd. But this is where things get a little bit more complicated. Yay. During World War I, when the Brits were at war with the Germans, King George V decided to change the family name to Windsor, after a beloved English castle, and strip foreign princes of their British royal titles, and convince many of his British family members with foreign titles to dump their German names and titles. Good Lord, that's a lot to take in. In exchange, George made many of them, we're talking the British citizens, peers of the realm. For example, the Battenbergs became the Mountbattens because it sounded more British. And King George bestowed Prince Louis, the other Prince Louis's father, with a Marquess title. You really need a family tree to keep all this straight. So now, Prince Louis of Battenberg became Louis Mountbatten. Louis, known as Dickie within the family, and Mountbatten for the purposes of this podcast, was born and raised in the UK. Though he was only a minor royal, he traveled extensively, visiting relatives in other countries, and was especially close to his Imperial Romanov cousins in Russia, and may have even had a thing for Grand Duchess Maria, who was the daughter of Tsar Nicholas II, and was killed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. Like I said, lots of intrigue in this family. When Mountbatten was 16, he was sent off to serve in the British Royal Navy in 1916 at the height of World War I. Mind you, this was a thing lots of royal sons did. Mountbatten's father had been in the Royal Navy, as had King George VI, Prince Philip, King Charles, and even the disgraced Prince Andrew, not to mention countless other British princes that I can't remember off the top of my head. During his time in the Navy, Mountbatten distinguished himself in his own right, and with, a little help from his king cousins, rose through the ranks. By 1934, he commanded his own ship, and during World War II, became an admiral and commanded the who's who of British vessels. Mountbatten was distinguished, intelligent, and knew all the right people, including Winston Churchill, who appointed Mountbatten as the Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia Command. Though it was mainly the men he commanded who did the heavy lifting, Mountbatten was the one in command when the Brits took back Burma and Singapore from the Japanese, which led not only to the creation of his own title, Earl Mountbatten of Burma, but also led to him being named Viceroy of India. Yeah, now we're playing in the big leagues. Once again, we got crime to talk about, so I'll try to hurry this along. Britain wanted to get out of India because, well, it couldn't be seen as a colonial power anymore, and wanted to grant India its independence by June 1948. Mountbatten was told to ensure India remained a single state, but was also told to do whatever you have to do to get us out of there before July. Negotiations between Indian Hindus and Muslims broke down, and Mountbatten made the ultimate decision to partition India into two states in order to make the new August 1947 deadline. If you know your history, you know this decision led to the deaths of millions of Hindus and Muslims, and is one of the reasons there is so much animosity between India and Pakistan today. Why do I bring all this up? Simply to impress upon you how important Mountbatten was to the UK, the royal family, and to history. He may have been a minor royal, but he was an important military and political figure of his day. Huge military and political figure. After India, he took on even more illustrious assignments, including aide-de-camp to Queen Elizabeth and Admiral of the Fleet. During all this time, he took a hand in raising his nephew, Prince Philip, and was a mentor to his grandnephew, Prince Charles, now King Charles. Mountbatten and his wife weren't on the best of terms, and Mountbatten spent a lot of time with other women, including actress Shirley MacLaine, who was quite a bit younger than him. Mountbatten, love him or hate him, he was loved and hated by many, and he was really hated by the IRA. Yeah, you know where I'm going with this, don't you? We'll get there in a moment. First, I want to tell you about the Irish Republican Army. My introduction to the IRA was through the movie Patriot Games, because who doesn't love Harrison Ford as Jack Ryan? Which was inspired by what we're going to talk a little bit about today. I think for a lot of Americans, we didn't see the IRA as much of a problem compared to Middle Eastern terrorist organizations. And some Americans, believe it or not, even helped fund them because a lot of Americans identify as Irish Americans, especially on St. Patrick's Day. But the IRA was a major thorn in the side of the British. And I totally ripped this next bit off from the History Channel because it summed up the history of the IRA without me nerding out for 30 minutes and then going off on a tangent about Michael Collins, which is also another great movie, this one with Liam Neeson. Anyway, established in 1919 to halt British rule in Northern Ireland using armed forces, the Irish Republican Army fought for independence in a reunified republic, often in tandem with, but not independent of, the Irish National Party, Sinn Féin. In 1969, demanding the withdrawal of British forces from Northern Ireland, but differing on tactics, the IRA split into two factions, officials and provisionals. Officials sought independence through peace, while provisionals used violence to further its efforts, which resulted in an estimated, and I'm probably lowballing this, like 1,800 deaths, including more than, I'm just estimating and lowballing this, 600 civilians. As the Provisional IRA and other paramilitary groups waged an increasingly violent campaign, and the British Army retaliated, and they did that a lot, the period became known as the Troubles. And it roiled the region, the UK, and even mainland Europe for nearly 30 years. And also, despite what many people think, this wasn't really a Catholic versus Protestant thing. It had little to do with religious ideology and more to do with politics. While many Northern Irish Catholics supported home rule, and many Northern Irish Protestants supported maintaining their place in the UK, it was more about historical immigration than religion. Irish Protestants were descendants of British immigrants to Northern Ireland, mainly in Ulster. And some Protestants supported home rule, and some Catholics supported the UK. It was more about ethnicity rather than religion, though it is mainly referred to as Catholics versus Protestants, and it's difficult to get away from that. While there was some violence in Northern Ireland before 1969, the Troubles were particularly bloody. It started off in 1966 when minority Catholics protested against the Protestant majority police and loyalist militias. Yeah, there were militias on both sides. The protests got pretty heated. Both sides were actually bombing each other, and the military was called in to keep the peace. At first, many Catholics were okay with the Brits coming in because at least they weren't as bad as the police. But at last, the British Army was pretty heavy-handed too. In October 1970, the Provisional IRA, and I'll just call them the IRA from here on out, began a bombing campaign throughout Northern Ireland. If the Catholics couldn't vote the Protestants out, then the IRA would bomb the government out. Unfortunately, it got to the point where the British Army considered almost every Catholic protester dangerous, and this came to a head on Bloody Sunday. On January 30th, 1972, British paratroopers killed 13 unarmed Catholic civil rights demonstrators and wounded 15 others during a civil rights march in Derry. For years, the British government stood by their claim that the protesters were actually gunmen and bombers. But later on, a 2010 report admitted that the protesters were unarmed and not a threat to the paratroopers. The Bloody Sunday Massacre inspired hundreds of people to join the IRA. Citing security concerns, the British government suspended the Northern Ireland Parliament and took over direct rule, which was fine for the IRA because now it was the IRA against the Brits. The Brits rolled in tanks. The IRA bombed police stations. The Brits increased the number of troops in Northern Ireland. The IRA bombed pubs in England, popular among law enforcement, and on, back and forth. There was a brief ceasefire in the winter of 1974-75, but the IRA thought it was complete bullshit and started up their bombing campaign shortly after. In response to this, the Brits enlisted members of the Northern Ireland Police Force and loyalist militias to help track down the IRA. The problem was, the police and the loyalist militias were part of the problem too. They also had blood on their hands and were known to kill not only suspected IRA members, but also innocent Catholics. In response to this, the IRA kind of joined forces with Sinn Féin. Sinn Féin would run the political and propaganda war, and the IRA would run the armed portion. It became known as the Long War, and the IRA ceased its mass bombing operations and focused on strategic targets, especially against members of security forces. They called it armed propaganda, and they wanted to use the outrageousness of the attacks to gain national attention. The more shocking the attack, the more publicity they would get. And they got a lot of publicity on August 27th, 1979. Sometimes I think it must be nice being rich. If I were wealthy, I would have a summer home on the Olympic Peninsula and a winter home in the south of France. I would spend my autumns in some quaint village in England or Germany and my springs traveling to various places in the southern hemisphere. I could definitely do a season in Sao Paulo. While Mountbatten wasn't super wealthy, he did have houses and castles in various parts of the UK. In August 1979, Mountbatten and members of his family were spending the summer at Classabone Castle near the village of Claphoney, County Sligo, in the Republic of Ireland. The day dawned sunny on August 27th, and Lord Mountbatten, his daughter Patricia, her husband, her mother-in-law, and 14-year-old twin sons Timothy and Nicholas, along with a 15-year-old friend Paul Maxwell, decided to go lobstering on Mountbatten's 29-foot fishing boat, the Shadow 5. What the family didn't know was that the night before, Thomas McCohen, a member of the IRA and one of its most experienced bomb makers, planted a 50-pound Geglinite bomb onto the hull of the boat. As McCohen was making his getaway, he was apprehended by the National Police and Security Services for driving a stolen vehicle. They took him into custody, but knew nothing about the carnage that would play out about 2 hours later. Later that day, Lord Mountbatten and his family boarded the Shadow 5 and pulled away from the dock, set on enjoying a day of setting lobster pots. 15 minutes later, 2 other IRA members detonated the bomb attached to the boat. 50 pounds of Geglimite exploded, sending showers of timber, metal, cushions, life jackets, and shoes into the air. Andrew Loney, author of The Mountbattens, Their Lives and Loves, wrote for the BBC. Then there was deadly silence. Fishermen in the vicinity of the explosion rushed to respond to the scene. All the passengers were pulled out of the water, including Lord Mountbatten, who was still alive, but died from his injuries before he made it to shore. His grandson Nicholas and the 15-year-old Maxwell were instantly killed. Patricia Mountbatten's mother-in-law, the Dowager Lady Doreen Browborn, died the next day from her injuries. Lady Patricia, her husband, and their son Timothy survived, but with horrific injuries. Why Mountbatten? Mountbatten was an easy target. He had been vacationing in the Irish town of Mullaghmore throughout the 1970s and had refused security detail and left his boat unguarded despite repeated threats from the IRA to assassinate him. Mountbatten had just said, who the hell would want to kill an old man anyway? Brendan O'Leary, a political science professor at the University of Pennsylvania and the author of A Treatise of Northern Ireland, noted that while Mountbatten could not have predicted the IRA would plant a bomb on his boat, he had been lax in his own security. He had been Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia and was said to have been the youngest admiral in the history of the Navy, O'Leary said. He was also known as the last Viceroy of India, who had overseen its partition. He was therefore a very prominent public figure, but a retired man of 79 who played no role in the British security forces in Northern Ireland and who regularly holidayed in Ireland, could not be described as a legitimate war target. Sinn Féin Vice President Gary Adams disagreed and said that Mountbatten was a military target in a war situation, which the IRA was convinced they were in, and were quick to take credit for the assassination and said this operation is one of the discriminate ways we can bring to attention of the English people the continuing occupation of our country. Well, the attack certainly did get the English people and the world's attention, but not in the way the IRA would have liked. While the assassination of Lord Mountbatten and the murder of an innocent woman and 2 boys was horrible enough, it was not the only carnage carried out by the IRA that day. Shortly after the bombing that killed Mountbatten, the IRA ambushed British soldiers stationed in Northern Ireland. At Warren Point in County Down, on the road that marks the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, the IRA set up a 800-pound fertilizer bomb hidden in hay bales on a truck on the roadside. The IRA detonated the bomb as a British convoy of a Land Rover and 2 4-ton trucks carrying members of the 2nd Battalion Parachute Regiment drove by. The explosion was especially devastating to the last truck in the convoy because the force of the blast was so strong that it hurled the truck up and to the side, instantly killing 6 paratroopers. The heat of the blast nearly vaporized the truck driver, Anthony Wood, whose pelvis was the only thing that remained of him. Immediately after the blast, IRA gunmen opened up rifle fire on the survivors as the remaining soldiers radioed for assistance. A rapid reaction unit responded via helicopter to drop off the scene commander and pick up the wounded. As the helicopter was taking off, another 800-pound bomb hidden in milk pails detonated and killed another 12 soldiers, including the scene commander, Lieutenant Colonel David Blair. The blast was so horrific that witnesses and other responders saw human remains scattered across the road, in the water, and hanging from trees. Colonel Blair was only identified by one of his epaulets, and a major was asked to identify the remains of a friend from the victim's face that had been ripped from his head. The ambush was the most successful IRA attack on British soldiers since the Troubles began, and the group was once again quick to take credit for the attack and claimed that it was in retaliation for Bloody Sunday, when the same parachute regiment had killed the 13 unarmed civilians. After the attack, graffiti appeared in Republican sympathetic areas that read, 13 gone and not forgotten. We got 18 and Mountbatten. The outrage against the assassination and then the ambush was swift. Both British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and Irish Taoiseach Jack Lynch condemned the attack, and world leaders such as President Jimmy Carter and Pope John Paul II offered the royal family and the British people their sympathy. The English people were appalled and angry, but it was the reaction of the Irish people that is really worth noting. To them, Mountbatten had been a war hero, and the deaths of an innocent woman and 2 children were absolutely horrifying. While some IRA sympathizers understood the motives behind the ambush of British soldiers, they couldn't support the attack on a retired public servant and his family. Within the United States, the backlash against the IRA was sharp. The Irish Americans who had been donating money to the IRA cause ceased and desisted all fundraising activities. The Boston Globe and the New York Times, 2 newspapers popular among Irish American Catholics, condemned the attack, offered no sympathy for the IRA's plight, and even went so far as to encourage brutal retaliation against the IRA. The FBI formed a special task force to track down IRA gun runners engaged in obtaining American weapons and successfully reduce the importation of American firearms to the IRA. Within Britain, evidence gathered against Thomas McCohen's clothing, they found bomb residue, was enough to convict him of Mountbatten's murders and send McCohen to prison. Margaret Thatcher took off the gloves and responded by stripping IRA prisoners of their political rights associated with prisoner of war status, since now the world viewed them as criminals rather than a political organization. She went on to authorize the Special Air Service, aka the SAS, aka Will Make You Wish Your Father and Mother Never Met, to kill all known IRA volunteers who were on active operation. It was a hunt and kill order that the SAS aggressively followed and succeeded at. Following Mountbatten's assassination, Burma, also known as Myanmar today, observed 3 days of mourning, while India declared 7 days of mourning. Lord Mountbatten's funeral was held on September 5, 1979, under heavy security, and was attended by the Queen and the royal family, members from other European royal families, Margaret Thatcher and former British prime ministers, and representatives from several countries. His coffin was carried in a cavalry armor and accompanied by 118 members of the Royal Navy, joined by military personnel from Burma, India, Canada, France, and even the United States. He was laid to rest in Romsey Abbey. As for the IRA, while they continued their sporadic bombing and other campaigns of violence, they tried other tactics to gain publicity and sympathy, such as IRA prisoners going on hunger strikes. Bobby Sands, an IRA member and incarcerated in prison maze in Northern Ireland, died as a result of his hunger strike, and his death inspired many young Irish to join the IRA. And you can watch a movie about him called Hunger, starring Liam Cunningham and Michael Fassbender. However, it was not the IRA that brought about peace, but it was diplomacy. On April 10, 1998, it was Good Friday, the British government and most of Northern Ireland's political parties, including Sinn Féin, signed a peace deal that reestablished Northern Ireland's self-rule and acknowledged that while most people in Northern Ireland wanted to remain a part of the UK, many people in the whole of Ireland believed Northern Ireland should be a part of the Republic of Ireland. It was pretty much a calling it spade to spade in order to establish peace. The Good Friday Agreement was endorsed by voters in Northern Ireland and in the Republic of Ireland. In exchange, the British government released 428 Irish political prisoners, including Thomas McCowan, and then later admitted to the deaths of innocent civilians during Bloody Sunday. While the Good Friday Accords didn't heal all wounds, it was certainly a start, and they hold fast to this day. I find it a little bit ironic that as I was finishing up writing this episode, someone tried to assassinate former US President Donald Trump. I admit, I stared blankly at the TV for a while because I think I've become so desensitized to sensational global events. It took me a while to logically think about the repercussions of the shooting, and it was only then that my emotions kicked in. And I got really angry. Putting aside any political beliefs I may have, I got really pissed off because that shooter tried to take away my right as a voter to decide who gets to lead my country. Also, political violence has no place in democracy. It doesn't work. You might try to throw all sorts of examples at me, but in the end, political violence is just plain bullshit. It didn't work for the IRA. It hasn't worked with the Basque in Spain. And it didn't work with the Red Army faction in Germany. And it didn't work with the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. It just doesn't work. What has and does work is voting and nonviolent movements. You want to make a change? Get a petition going to get your cause on a voting ballot. Lots of that is going on in the United States right now. Is there a political opponent you want to see defeated? Campaign and vote for the other guy. See an injustice in your community? Try peaceful civil disobedience and lawsuits. All of these things have historically and are currently working. Want to know what doesn't work? Taking a shot at a political candidate or blowing up a boat with children on board. All you're doing is making your opponent stronger and giving them the moral high ground. Probably not what you were going for. Trust me, it's a lot more easy and effective to cast a vote than it is to plan and execute an act of violence. Don't be an idiot. Get out and vote. This episode, I want to tell you about the murder of 7-year-old Dalton Messerchick. On the evening of March 26, 2003, Dalton stood on the front porch of his house in Streator, Illinois, located about 2 hours south of Chicago. He was waiting for a church van to pick him up for weekday evening services. The van never came, and Dalton went missing. The next day, a fisherman found Dalton's body floating in the Vermilion River, and days later, a hammer discovered behind a local business was determined to be the murder weapon. An intense, multi-jurisdictional investigation ensued. Agents from the Streator Police Department, Livingston County Sheriff's Department, and Illinois State Police interviewed dozens of people and followed up on hundreds of leads in an attempt to identify the person responsible for Dalton's murder. Physical evidence from Dalton's body and the body recovery site was sent to the ISP crime lab for processing. Still, no one has ever been arrested or charged for Dalton's murder. Investigators and Dalton's family are unsure why anybody would want to harm Dalton, who would be 28 this year. Dalton's mother, Danielle, believes someone who knew the church van was not coming and who knew Dalton took him because Dalton was wary of strangers. Dalton's murder has haunted his family in the town of Streator, and his family deserves answers. There is a $50,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest and conviction of Dalton's killer. If you have any information about Dalton's murder, no matter how small or insignificant you may think it is, please contact the Illinois State Police Dalton Messerschmitt Task Force at 815-844-1500, extension 2321, or email at daltonim@isp.state.il.us. You can also contact the FBI's toll-free tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI 225-5324, or submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. If you feel uncomfortable going to the police, you can reach out to me at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com or on Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. Someone out there knows something. You may not, but you might know people in Illinois who do. Share Dalton's story with them. So back in 2022, I told you about a young woman who had been kidnapped, held captive for a month, and repeatedly sexually assaulted outside of Kansas City, Missouri. The woman managed to escape and notified police of her nightmare ordeal. The police investigated and arrested Timothy M. Haslett on multiple charges, including kidnapping and rape. For months previously, before this woman's kidnapping and attack, the Black community of Kansas City, time and again, told the police Black women and sex workers were going missing, but their charges were not taken very seriously. Until Haslett's arrest. In Haslett's home, they found photos of other women being tortured and tried to identify them. Sadly, one of those victims was found in June 2023. Her remains were found in a blue plastic barrel floating in the Missouri River. Earlier this month, Haslett was charged in the murder of 36-year-old Janie Crossdale. Police are still investigating the identities of the other women from the other photos. What really gets me is that I firmly believe in community action and community policing. If you see something, say something. But what happens when you say something and the police do little to respond? It's 2024, and some police agencies and even our own society still care little for the lives of Black women and the lives of sex workers, regardless of race or gender. This story barely made the news until Haslett became a suspected serial killer. Let's do better. If these women's lives do not matter, then as a whole, we have failed as a society. Because how can we protect all of us if we can't even protect the most vulnerable around us? Folks, open your eyes and pay attention to what's going on in your community. If your local law enforcement isn't doing enough to protect your community, demand action. It's our duty, it's our obligation as a community to not only look out for ourselves, but to look out for each other. Do better and stay safe. And take care of yourselves. And take care of each other. Later.